All right, so first of all, before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping updates. So this is a 1-hour event. We will monitor the chat box throughout the event, but to run it effectively, please hold on to your questions during the speaker's talk itself. We'll be opening the chat for any questions and comments during our Q&A session towards the end of the event. And also, the session will be recorded for later viewing, and we will make it available on our library's website. And we would like to encourage our audience to please turn up your own video cameras to help us reduce internet bandwidth usage during the event. All right, so I think I covered everything that we need to cover. Okay, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Kim. I'm the director of the Jayeeta Station Library at the University of Toronto. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the myth sagas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. On behalf of the Jayeeta Station Library, I'd like to welcome you to the Asian Heritage Month celebration event. Have you eaten yet? A dialogue with Cheuk Kwan. Thank you for joining us on this very special occasion. May is Asian Heritage Month, during which we celebrate Asian Canadians whose rich heritage has enriched the history of Canada while having their lives dramatically influenced by moments in its history. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Government of Canada's official declaration of May as Asian Heritage Month. The theme for 2022 is continuing a legacy of greatness and serves as a reminder for all Canadians to come together to fight anti-Asian racism and discrimination in all its forms. Today, we are very pleased to host a dialogue with filmmaker Cheuk Kwan about his new book, Have You Eaten Yet? His book explores the global Chinese community and how Chinese immigrants grapple with assimilation, issues of cultural identity, and economic survival. Inspired by his own 15-part documentary series, Chinese Restaurants, in his new book, Mr. Kwan considers the international Chinese community through the lens of food. Mr. Kwan is also the co-founder of The Asianadian, an Asian Canadian magazine, which is an important early Asian Canadian cultural and literary publication. In 2018, the East Asian Library celebrated the 40th anniversary of the magazine's founding, along with Mr. Kwan and the Asianadian Collective. The library holds the entire run of the Asianadian magazine here. Today's conversation with Cheuk Kwan will be led by Professor Jayeeta Sharma. Professor Sharma is an associate professor of history, global Asia studies, and food studies at the University of Toronto, and the director of the Feeding City Virtual Research Lab at the Culinaria Research Center of the University of Toronto. She is on the editorial board of the journal Global Food History and the editorial collective for Radical History Review. Her research examines food, mobilities, labor, family, and gender in imperial and post-colonial spaces. Before we begin today's conversation, we'd like to screen a 5-minute trailer of the documentary series, Chinese Restaurants, which Mr. Kwan created over the course of 4 years by traveling the globe. Thank you.
I'm myself. That's what I think about it. I am me. Canadian, Chinese, Japanese, Italian, no matter. I am me.
Is that real?
Should I make the noise?
Is that real?
Huh?
Oh!
I always feel like I'm an Indian, unless when I look at myself, I said, oh no, I'm not. Otherwise, I feel I'm an Indian.
I'm a Trinidadian Chinese. I think that I'm very patriotic towards my country, Trinidad.
Eu sou chinês brasileiro, mas em muitos aspectos eu sou mais brasileiro que chinês.
Suitable for local people. Local people like a little bit chili hot, you see that, and chicken fry, and on top it put some soybean sauce, you see that, and fried it up, you see. It's quite tasteful, you see. It's quite good, you see.
Voilà. Il y a des plats mauriciens aussi. On fait l'adobe de poisson avec des oignons et tomates, l'ail, piment, du thym. C'est un plat mauricien. Ça aussi, je sais faire.
La soupe chinoise est connue de tous les malgaches, en fait. Alors, tout le monde connaît la soupe chinoise. C'est presque un plat national, on pourrait dire.
Just as wonton soup has been assimilated into the Malagasy cuisine as soupe chinoise, the Chinese, over generations, have become part of the cultural fabric of the Big Island. Maybe this is the direction the rest of the world should be heading, a place where cultures and races have intermingled so completely that it doesn't matter where one's ancestors are from. What matters is the life we create for ourselves in a place we call home.
在土耳其，我是第一结婚的一位，所以还有比我大的姐姐哥哥呢。本来他们都不要我嫁给土耳其人。
There's no national pride in it because we always felt we were sojourning here. The place actually belonged to the whites.
Tochi Perú. 谢谢 Milú. Gracias Perú. Muchas gracias Perú. Yo gracias China por habernos dado 15 con la
的出路。生长在地球上就变成地球人就好了。这个地域观念呢，实在是很糟糕。
首先咧，好多次我同人哋講，我而家活到60歲，我有3個國籍。第一係中國國籍，第二係越南國籍，而家我有以色列國籍。咁到底我係咩人？其實好簡單，我係中國人。無論我擁有咩國籍，我係中國人。
Sorry, the clanging was my having just arrived at the office. Hello, everyone. I'm Sharma. I'm actually speaking from the beautiful campus of the University of Toronto Scarborough, where in Scarborough you can actually get some of the greatest food in the world. And I hope Mr. Kwan will be turning his camera and his pen to documenting some of those restaurants very soon with his wonderful cinematographer, who I see is also in our audience. And I really salute the artistry and the dedication of this amazing team. And yeah, it is my honor and privilege to be talking with you about this amazing book. I also, maybe in a good position, do I feel many of these people, because I have been teaching from, yes, right side up. I have been teaching from Mr. Kwan's films, particularly the amazing moving sections from Tangra, Calcutta, Chinatown for many years in the course that we offer at the University of Toronto Scarborough, Asian Foods in Global Cities, where on a much smaller scale of what the author has done, we actually start our journey in Guangdong, southern China, and Kolkata, Chinatown, where some of the events and stories he documents actually happened in the late 19th century, because Chinese migrants, and often known by pejorative names such as John Chinaman or coolies, actually journeyed in search of livelihoods, liberty, and made lives for themselves, but also took their foods and tastes and their stories to countries all over. And in this amazing book, what we have, but just as Mr. Kwan showed us a teaser from his films, because yes, now there are 3 wonderful films just showed at Release Asian Film Festival, and you can actually sign up in the month of May for a free viewing of all 3 films. So he had earlier made 15 films. And those we actually have at the library of the University of Toronto Scarborough. We've been able to show them to our students over the years. And since I teach in Global Asia, I had mostly shown the parts relating to Kolkata and Bombay, 2 very different sets of Chinese restaurants. And it was amazing that in this book to have him start all the way in Madagascar to talk with folks whose ancestor came from Taishan, just as I believe your fellow filmmakers' ancestors did, and to speak in dialect, to speak in Mandarin, in English, to travel across cities and countries and continents, but to bring us these stories. So this is a dialogue, and I know the audience will have many, many things to ask, and I hope people have had a chance to watch some of the films, and if they haven't read the book yet, to read it. I don't know about the Toronto Public Library, but I took a sneak peek, and at the Vancouver Public Library, there are like 80 or 200 holes on it waiting for the book. So folks, if the Toronto Public Library hasn't acquired it, write to them, ask them to buy it, put a hold on it and get it, and better still buy it yourself. However, this is part of my question for Mr. Kwan. Do you have plans to actually perhaps have your films available for people who access books or materials in other languages? Because what comes for me as a scholar of language, culture, society, history, and food is, again, when you saw, when you have that section where you talk about the Taishanese dialect, and I am thinking of, the wonderful Gold Mountain stories, the sad yet poignant yet uplifting stories, as a historian that I have the privilege to read and teach. And so those stories come alive from the present day. And I know you have said in an interview that you wrote this book also for non-Chinese readers as well as Chinese diasporic readers. But I also wondered, what is the view of sharing these stories back with the communities? Because as I speak, I've just finished a meeting with food security organizations working in Scarborough. And we have managed to find student research assistants who need to speak Cantonese and Mandarin, because that is what many of our communities are still comfortable with, whether they're in China, whether they're in Hong Kong, whether they're in Taishan County or in Scarborough and Toronto. Over to you, Mr. Kwan.
Well, before I start answering your question, and please remind me if I forgot, I'm so happy that you brought up Scarborough, because this is now the recognized epicenter of quote unquote ethnic food, but specifically about Indo-Hakka food. And I'll tell you a little trick that secret that I haven't told anybody before. The Calcutta footage of the owner making chili chicken, which is a Indo-Hakka specialty created in Calcutta 100 years ago, and very famous dish around Scarborough. When my cameraman Kwa and I went there, we forgot to take a photo, shoot the making of chili chicken. So when we came home, when I was editing the film, I needed to get some footage of the chili chicken. So where do I go? I went to Frederick's, and I actually walked into the kitchen, asked the chef, and I said, "Can you make me a chili chicken?" Because this is the ubiquitous kind of Indo-Hakka food that you'll see, and it's the same whether it's made in Scarborough or made in Calcutta. So I'm so happy that you brought up the Scarborough food scene. As you know, publishing is a very, very tough business, and filmmaking is also a very tough business. I have my films will be available on YouTube as of June 1st. I've led Real Asian to have the one-month exclusive broadcasting of my film, but it will be done on June 1st. As well, I have a Chinese version of the film in Cantonese and Mandarin, and they will be. I will also put them up live on YouTube. So you at least get the English, Cantonese, and the Mandarin version of the film. About the book, my agent is actively trying to sell it to international audience. We have sold the US rights, so we'll be coming out in the US later on this year. However, we're still waiting to sell the Chinese rights as well as international rights, particularly in the UK and Hong Kong and so forth. So these are kind of and of course they have to be translated as well when it's in Chinese or French or Spanish.
That is absolutely fabulous news, because, and certainly I'm going to be sharing out with our community networks the news that, they can view these films on YouTube. You'll be happy to know that, we already have them available through our UT libraries, yes. Because in fact, I'll be speaking to some of our students in the next 2 semesters, if you will be so kind. But I think part of it is you are clearly a storyteller in many mediums. And that is where not just the mediums, and of course you kind of reverted the usual order, because usually people sell a book and then a film gets made of it, while you did the films first and then you wrote the book. And in an age when people are declaring that print is dead. So I guess that is the question.
Well, I think a book format allows me to explore the topics and go deeper into both the historical aspect as well as be more immersive in the experience that I went through. As you know, a film series with a 26-minute episode is kind of limiting, and I have to be very cognizant of the fact that this will be shown on TV, so people more and they might turn off the channel and whatnot. So I have to make it fairly entertaining. A book is a different format media. And every 5,000 chapter that I wrote allowed me to dig deeper into my story, and also afforded me so many years later to do a little bit more research on what I cover and put that into the context of the story. So I think it's a very interesting experiment. Now that you've seen film, read the book instead of the other way around. So in that sense, I think a book also comes at the right time. We're dealing with anti-Asian hate, and my publisher has asked me, that's why I wrote the epilogue, because everything I touch upon in the film almost 20 years ago is just as relevant as it is today. The racism, the discrimination Chinese immigrants faced when they first went to the host country. And now we have the anti-Asian hate because of COVID. And I think I need to deal with that. That's why for the epilogue, and of course the book.
Thank you, Mr. Kwan. And of course, we are also entering we have in fact already entered new repressions, because I'm sure I don't need to remind this audience of what's happening in Hong Kong and what has been happening, and it's being slowly revealed to us what has been happening in Xinjiang, for instance, or in Tibet, where
Yes.
I myself work.
Yes.
And in fact, this is where I found that chapter in Istanbul so moving. Because I will tell you that as a global Asia scholar, I have dealt with people who have bristled when taken to the wonderful Chinese halal restaurant in Scarborough and said, this is not Chinese food. They're not serving pork. They're only serving lamb and beef. And, and we have said to them, the owner, even though, that's a family that fled political repression in China, and they are Muslims and they don't eat pork, but they consider themselves Chinese. So that is, I think, one of the most beautiful points you bring out in that story in Istanbul. And in fact, you have dealt with the issue that while Chinese meat dumplings are usually made with pork, but now you have the varieties that are made with. So I wanted, I thought that was one of the most compelling of your many, many stories. So because, again, many of the book people may not have read your book as yet. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about your interactions there, which seem to have kind of transcended what is often conventionally.
Are you referring to Istanbul?
I'm referring to Istanbul, that to the family you met,
right.
Mr. there, and which I believe now is a interracial family. But then you put in these beautiful thoughts about your and Mr. Kwai's family, of your own family displacements.
Yes.
So I'm talking about those interwoven stories of dispossession.
Yeah. So just to go back to the book versus the film, in the book, I have a lot more room to deal with a lot of interiority for myself and for my cameraman, Kwa. I was able to put our life story in there. And of course, a lot of my meditating kind of thoughts about Chinese diaspora and Chinese food. So everything I put in the book, I sort of experienced firsthand, and it was not something that I do research on and write about it, but it's something that came from my heart. So in that sense, the book has that kind of a little bit more personal touch to it. As far as Istanbul is concerned, that was actually the starting point of my journey into Chinese restaurants. It was that place and that restaurant that prompted me to almost 25 years before I even start shooting the film, to tell myself that I wanted to make a film about the Chinese diaspora, because the stories that the family in Istanbul was so resonate so much with me, because as a diaspora myself, I grew up I was born in Hong Kong, grew up in Singapore, in Japan, came to the US for the university. I really, really resonate with what the children of that man have gone through, both from a displacement point of view, from having to move around when they were like 5 years old, and crossing into culture and politics and religion that is obviously alienating, sort of different from your own. So in that sense, it's a very story that is very dear to me. And if even the children, they were mostly my generation, my age, and the way they look at the father is exactly the way I look at my father, through pictures and memories and whatnot. So in that sense, I can say that is very close to my heart. How I found out the restaurant was in 1976. I was traveling, just going through Europe and Istanbul, and the travel guide told me that This is the only Chinese restaurant in town. And this is 1976. And I went in and went to the restaurant, and I had then met the family. Now, there's another story there's another adventure. If you read the book, you'll see that I actually met up with a psychopath who became a mass murderer. When I met him, he was just a nice guy, and so I actually went to the China restaurant. For those of you who watched the Netflix series, The Serpent, this is the guy. His name is, and he's very notoriously infamous for being a psychopath and killing other tourists back in the late 70s. So I actually met this guy. But anyway, that's a side story. But of course, I went to Istanbul, and I had, first confronted the concept of what is a Muslim Chinese. The fact that I had halal food, the fact that they look at, even though they're Han Chinese like myself, which 92% of the Chinese from mainland China are Han Chinese, but as you said, there's at least 8% of the population, which is 100 million people in the Chinese population around the world that are non-Han, or they could be Muslims, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Mongolians, even to very kind of indigenous tribes in southwestern China, in Yunnan and Guangxi. So in that
Jewish.
And all Jewish, of course, the Kaifeng Jews, who can forget about that, right? So you see in my book, I talk a lot about the Jewish diaspora, because together with the Indians, the Jews, and the Chinese, they are the three most diasporic people on earth. So in that sense, there's a lot of parallel that all these race and ethnicity have gone through. But yeah, and that was it was an eye-opening event. I decided at that time, 1976, that I was going to come back and make a movie out of this. So in 2000, I started in Saskatchewan, Canada, for my first episode, and then I eventually went to Istanbul and went back to the same restaurant, talked to the same family, and talk a little bit more about their history and how they have come to Istanbul. And the chapter, of course, is called "The Man Who Walked from China." That's because legend has it, his entourage had traveled on foot, camel, horseback, over the Himalayas into Pakistan, into refugee camps in Pakistan. And from there, they moved themselves towards Istanbul, because the father, or the patriarch of the family, had gone to Istanbul University when he was young. And so he's fluent in Turkish, and of course he's Muslim.
Thank you. And there's so many amazing stories in this book, but I wanted to now turn to page 101, because you went to one of the places I've always dreamed of going, Madagascar. So since you've also traversed oceans, but what you ended up, so I know we said you won't do a reading, but I'm going to take the liberty to just read a couple of sentences from this chapter.
Yeah.
So Mr. Kwan is in Brickaville. He's going with a local Cantonese speaker from the Tamatave Chinese school in Madagascar. He's discovered that soup chinois is the national soup of Madagascar. And he is going to up the mountains to this town of Brickaville. It used to be home to a large Chinese community, but for generations they married local people. They're all mixed race. And then at a small shop where bootleg rum is being sold, the woman's husband comes out to greet him in Cantonese. "Welcome, I'm Lai from Shunde." And Mr. Kwan replies, "I'm Kwan from Nanhai. I introduce myself as someone from a neighboring district." And this is so amazing, because I gather that I think it was in this set of encounters that not only were your families from neighboring districts, but you ended up somebody who had even known your father back in southern China?
Yes. Not really him, but certainly a lot of there is a man in Tamataf who came from. That knew my father. They went to the same high school as my father. But the point I wanted to make with all this is, so obviously the thing that what I discovered, I knew nothing about Chinese in Madagascar before I went there. It wasn't until a couple of weeks before I landed in Madagascar that I saw a Hong Kong television series, and they talk about, you know, the crew going to Madagascar and interviewing Chinese people. And I found out that in Madagascar, the Chinese have been there for 5-6 generations. And as you said, many of them are mixed throughout the generation. So if you go to the movie, there's a whole scene of my visiting of Chinese school. This is Chinese school in Tamataf, teaching 5th generation mixed kids how to write Chinese and how to speak Cantonese. And I find that so amazing. Nowhere on earth do you find that kind of preservation of Chinese culture through so many generations, even though they no longer look like Chinese. And in the book, I talk about it as well. But the nice thing about the man that I met in Brickaville is that there's a Chinese custom of always, telling people where you're from. Even though I have never been in China or into my grandfather's district, but I always tell people, oh, I'm from Nanhai County and you're from a neighboring county, so we're like neighbors. So that's kind of very similar greetings, like, have you eaten yet? Basically a familiarity of saying, hey, we're all together in this. And this is what I find so amazing about Chinese diaspora, is that they take care of each other. It doesn't matter which county you're from, which city you're from. You know, there's a whole comment about your native village and your native food, and of course, speaking your native dialect to somebody who could have been your neighbor many generations ago. So in that sense, I find that's part of my that trip to Brickaville is a little bit of my exposition to the whole concept of the Chinese diaspora connection. How we are all one world. We connect with each other. We may not speak the same dialect. We may not speak the same language even, but then we're all connected through Chinese food. And this man was, running a grocery store and selling baked goods, including mooncake, which is, you seldom find mooncake in Canada, except for Mid-Autumn Festival. But this store sells mooncake every day, every single day. Mooncake. So and mooncake is so Chinese that you don't imagine it in Madagascar. So that's why my whole Madagascar episode was such a eye-opening and fantastical kind of experience.
Thank you. And in fact, what one reads in your book, and of course one is lucky enough to see some of it in the film, is really those living worlds, the worlds and the stories that tie together those past and the present and the mobilities of those bodies, those peoples, the suffering, the joy, the tangible and intangible cultures. But as a historian, I will also say, I think one big accomplishment of yours, and I hope we can talk about it, because I'm looking now at page 156, the photograph, a walk fire at the kitchen of Hotel Valentino in Darjeeling. And I've done my research. I'm actually writing a book on the Himalayas right now. And part of what I'm writing about is in the nearby town of Kalimpong. I don't know whether you got the chance to go there, but there was a Chinese embassy. There was a Chinese bank. There were 3 Chinese schools. And thanks to the absolutely deplorable Indo-Chinese hostilities of the 1960s, all that was destroyed. And in Darjeeling and Kolkata, and as I know from the stories I've heard in Canada, so that rich Indo-Chinese culture was, so much of it was destroyed because of those 2 nation states posturing and, and it is in fact through those stories of food and eating that I, as a scholar, because this is a time when, the books hadn't appeared about the concentration camps in which, people were kept.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know if you had heard some of those as you interacted amongst the community when you were there in Kolkata and Darjeeling, because many of those families had suffered those experiences.
I had specifically wanted to go to Darjeeling because I've always heard about the 1962 Sino-Indian War, in which they were fighting over territory in the Himalayas, and they changed hands and whatnot, and of course people were put in concentration camps that I linked. It's akin to Japanese internment camp. Japanese Canadian internment camps in Canada, and I made a big point about that because I think there's we should all learn from our history. And what we are saying is that if you're fighting Japan and you've perceived Japan as your World War II enemy, then you're treating the Japanese Canadian, you're putting them in internment camp. You're treating them like enemy aliens, and that's exactly what the Indians did when they treated 3 generations worth of Chinese, Indo-Chinese as enemy aliens, and they had to put them in concentration camp in Rajasthan. And the whole kind of trip to Rajasthan was, again, one of these almost like a Holocaust scene where people are put in the boxcars with very, very little to eat and to sleep, and then they were transported for 3 or 4 days or 5-7 days to Rajasthan. So that whole experience, that prompted me that I wanted to deal with the issue. Everywhere I went, there was also always a reason why I want to pick that country. Some of that could be very entertaining, like tango or the World Cup, but some of it I like the Sino border war. Some of them are, for example, the apartheid in South Africa. I wanted to deal with that as well. So I went to Darjeeling specifically looking for that, and I was lucky to find that restaurant up there, and that allowed me to explore the whole issue of what it means to be a Chinese 3 generations down to become Indian. And as you can see from my trailer, the waiter from my Mumbai restaurant, Johnny Chi, he was the one that said, I thought I was Indian all my life, and I looked in my mirror and said, I'm not an Indian. Johnny Chi is actually half Polish, half Chinese. His mother came from Soviet gulags when the Soviets brought a lot of Polish people into internal USSR. This is right before the World War II, and of course during the World War II as well. So, and her mother was escaped as a teenager and went through Middle East and finally landed in Mumbai, and that's where they met the father. So that's another one of these kind of displaced people around the world that I dealt with. And of course, him being a mixed race, neither race are Indian, so he's Chinese and Polish. I think he's got double barriers in terms of fitting in life, basically. So that's another kind of discriminatory aspect of being an immigrant or a child of an immigrant that we always face in another country.
Definitely, but speaking as somebody who's visibly other myself, but also as somebody who's mother of a biracial child, I will say that is one of the interesting things that I see a possibility, as I think you indicate, you see in your own family, that our children and perhaps our grandchildren, and I would not, paper over the racism and the discrimination people face, but I think as you and Kwa have said in your conclusion, you see yourself as an internationalist. Mr. Kwai says now he wants to be a global citizen. And I think actually when I look at my daughter, who at different times can pass as Asian, as European, as Canadian, as Jewish, then perhaps that kind of belonging is possible, as perhaps it wasn't for older generations. So with this, we can turn it over to the audience, and thank you again for our master storyteller's presence here, Mr. Cheuk Kwan. Okay, so we will be in the Q&A section, and Hannah will let us know how people can best do it. Over to you, Hannah, and thank you again, Mr. Kwan.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for such intelligent dialogue that we've been having. I mean, I'm so happy that we, allow me to kind of explore a lot of themes that I try to bring out in my book.
Well, I haven't. We are going to ask you to tell some of these stories from Scarborough. That's what I do. So hopefully we can explore that over a good meal.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheuk and Professor Sharma, for the just very stimulating conversation. I was deeply enjoying the conversation here. So now for our audience, please feel free to raise your hand for any questions or comments or feedback, or you could type in directly into the chat as well. I don't see anything popping up in the chat. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions for Cheuk or Professor Sharma.
I have a quick question, if that's all right.
Yeah, so there is a question from Mike.
Yeah, that's right. So I just wanted to kind of ask a question about some of your favorite dishes. I think one of the things, as someone who's traveled a fair amount through Southeast Asia, is when I'm recounting stories of my travel, it's often through the food. So it'll be kind of, yeah, remember that city, it had the best noodle soup, or do you remember the fried rice we had there, or the curries, whatever the case may be. So yeah, when you recount some of the kind of places you've been, what are the dishes that stand out for you?
Well, I'm biased. I people ask me about authenticity. What is authentic Chinese food? And I've always kind of, at first I was saying, oh, classical, whatever. But I'm come to a conclusion that authenticity is what you grow up with, what your grandmother made, what your mother made. The of the Italian, making pasta, you also almost swear that that's the most authentic pasta sauce that I ever had. In that sense, because I grew up in Singapore, and all my childhood memories are full of Singaporean food, which, as you know, is a mixture of Indian, Malay, Chinese, and of course European food, and especially Chinese and the Malay part, and the Indonesian part, and the Indian part. That gives us so much the kind of uniqueness and texture in Singaporean food. In one of my chapters, I talk about the eating of chili crab. Chili crab is basically a Singapore invention. You can make crabs many ways, but this is the Singaporeans' way of eating it and making it. And that to me is authentic as it comes. So in that sense, yeah. But being also Cantonese, I always like, for example, my go-to standard is steamed fish with ginger and scallion. For that kind of purity of freshness of Cantonese food that are not overindulged by in the senses by different spices. Very, very delicate, steam just right, but then the ginger and the scallion would just bring out the whole taste to it. That to me is also a perfect rendition of a classical Cantonese food.
Sounds great.
I don't know
If I can if I
question.
can jump in here and just read out a couple of lines from the epilogue. And I have to say, Mr. Kwan, the part I envied you most is Singapore, because I have visited Singapore only 3 times in my life. And obviously the pandemic has prevented that. But I was salivating when you talked about your earliest food memories of sautés, rojaks, and Hainanese chicken rice. And then you talked about your childhood favorite, Penang laksa, a seafood-laden noodle soup that's aromatic, tangy, and spicy, and bubur cha-cha, a coconut milk dessert flavored with pandan leaf, containing pearl sago, sweet potato, and taro. And I will say that living as we do, at least our kitchen lab is located in Scarborough, I think we can have repeat what the East Asian Library has done, and we could perhaps have a cooking feast with some of the dishes from your book. I don't think we can do chili crab because we can't get crab that is as good, but we could certainly do some of the others. So I think this
No,
might
I'll be the first one to volunteer to help you.
All right, do we have any other questions from the audience? Please feel free to raise your hand.
So I'll just go on a little bit about I was mentioning to Joe, how I pick each country, and first of all, I purposely avoided the cliche places like San Francisco, Vancouver. Just because it's only cliche. So only one chapter is about the Chinese cafe in Saskatchewan. The rest of them are in non-traditional places, places that I want to visit, places I've been to that I find it very exotic and very interesting. And then of course, what prompted me to go there is must be some reason. I love Cuban music, so I wanted to do on Cuba. Not to mention the fact that Havana, Lima, and San Francisco were the 3 largest Chinatowns in North America, in the Americas, at the turn of the last century. So just imagine, there's a whole world out there. We are Anglo-Saxon. I'm an Anglo-Saxon immigrant, meaning that I speak English when Anglophone immigrant. I speak English when I was a child, so I naturally. I came to the US, or people go to Australia or London to finish their education. But there are a lot of immigrants from China that has no language preference. So what they do is they become indentured laborers in Peru and working very hard, and basically they settled in Peru and became Spanish speaking. And then you have French speaking people in Mauritius. So I've always been fascinated by non-English speaking immigrants, because I find that there's a whole history that we Anglophones kind of ignore, because we before I made the film, I was hardly aware of the kind of non-English speaking diaspora, but there are just as many in the Latino or Spanish speaking world, as well as there are a lot of, like Madagascar and Mauritius, are French speaking Chinese immigrants. So in that sense, I think that's also another motivation for me to go away from the cliche. And of course, there's my likes and dislikes. I love tango. I love to watch soccer. So I went to I was in Sao Paulo during the World Cup when Brazil won 2-0, beating Germany. Of course, I was in Cuba for the Buena Vista Social Club, the Cuban music, and all that's kind of little reasons here and there. Not to mention social political, the apartheid, the Vietnamese boat people coming into, going around across the world. In this case, he went to Israel, and of course, I want to go to Israel because I want to deal with the religion, the whole Christianity versus Judaism, and the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I really wanted to deal with. And so I want to make it as topical as possible, but with as much variety as possible.
No, that is something I think which is a big key point of your book, because I absolutely agree. You know, while there's amazing Chinese food in Vancouver and San Francisco and so on, these are the stories. And to hear about the one Chinese restaurant in Manaus. and I will say that, like you, I went to Sao Paulo and I went and had some really, in fact, we stayed in a Japanese hotel. But I was not aware of the Chinese restaurant, and I see it was actually a Japanese interlocutor who took you there. But I think I wanted to actually focus on your mention on Cuba, because that again brings us to the issue of, so you talk about how the Chinese food in Cuba is not good food, and it can't be good food because of the scarcity of the ingredients. And in a way, it kind of mirrors what the first Chinese immigrants to North America, who were not cooks and who were basically cooking what they could cook to survive and who catered to working class customers. In a way, I think, again, embedded in the stories you tell us are those historical stories of hunger, scarcity, but also resilience, mobility, and intercultural connections. Hannah, do we have any more questions that I might have missed?
I don't see any other questions, but there is a comment coming from Tam Goosen. Congratulations, Cheuk, for your book. Your film series is history making, giving voice to all the hardworking Chinese restaurant workers all over the world. What a fantastic effort. All the best, Tam.
Thank you.
Tam Goosen is a dear friend of mine for many, many years. In fact, I was just talking about her to another friend, Paula Bean, while I was in Vancouver last week. But anyway, hello, Tam. Yeah, thank you very much for your comment.
Well, I think, again, from this comment, we can bring out one of the other threads that's there in the book, and which I hope very much that, we can talk to you because about the Chinese workers, the immigrants who, work in our grocery stores, who are growing foods in the community gardens where, in fact, we've been starting to document the embodied knowledge they bring us, who are selling where, I go and buy zucchini flowers on the street in Chinatown East. That is the embodied knowledge, the food provisioning they provide us. But the restaurant workers, which has, Tam Goosen reminded us that, because that is really the story of labor and food, of movement, but also of dispossession, of local, but also of universal themes that your book has brought us. And I think it's my colleague, Helen Wu, who has congratulated you on your new book. And I think she might be offering to translate it into Chinese. She actually teaches Chinese at UTSC, so I would jump on that offer if it worked out. But yes, so Hannah, are we going to be wrapping up soon? Should we ask if there's last question?
Yes, there's one more question, maybe after this, and then we can wrap it up. Okay, so for Cheuk, what might be the next project coming from Lucy again?
Well, I don't. My film was the only. I didn't become a filmmaker to be a filmmaker. I become a filmmaker to make my film on Chinese restaurants. Similarly, I'm an author. You probably figured out that this is my first book, and I certainly don't have a sequel in mind, and certainly I'm not a writer, so I probably won't be. I'll be resting on my laurels. How's that?
Great.
But I certainly enjoy. I certainly enjoyed all the conversation dialogue that I've been having since the book came out, and also I think the book rekindled a lot of interest in my film. And for those who may not have joined us in the beginning, I told Joe that on June 1st, I'll be releasing in YouTube all my complete Chinese restaurant series, every single episode, complete episodes in English for now. It has been made into a French, Chinese and a Mandarin version, a Cantonese and Mandarin version. French version can be found in my DVDs. I have also went to Hong Kong some years ago, have a very famous narrator pretend to be me, and of course narrating the Chinese version of it, both in Cantonese and Mandarin. So those will all be out. In the meantime, I know that Toronto Public Library has about 180 holds on 21 copies right now. So I know it's a long wait. It's cheap enough. I think we can all maybe help out our independent bookstores. I think that's the message I want to give to the reading public. Patronize your independent bookstore.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful message. Patronize book reading, patronize independent bookstores rather than trying to buy it from Amazon. But also, I hope that from this wonderful team, because, it is wonderful to have both you and your camera person here, is we have at the university and beyond, we have wonderful young Chinese Canadian, Asian Canadian, and Canadian filmmakers and, young people working on Asian food cultures, on food sovereignty, would love to be mentored by you. So I hope we can stay in touch, because you have your film production company, and what, my collaborators and I have been looking for is people who can help us tell those stories. There was a film on Scarborough recently that has deservedly won accolades, but what it doesn't tell the story of, and it wasn't its mission, was to tell the story of these Scarborough foodways that are also global foodways, which are also just a type of stories of individuals, of culture, of themes and materials that resonate with each of us. So we haven't eaten yet, but I hope many of us will eat together. And thank you very much to Hannah Kim and the East Asian Library, to the author, and to all the audience members. We still have 2 minutes if the author wants to have the last word. Thank you, everyone in the audience.
Yeah, just as a plug, on July 20th, I will be at BC. I think might be a hybrid event where the Museum of Vancouver is having a half-day session entitled, I think, Food, Film, and Activism. Basically, it's organized by University of British Columbia. Basically, I was told when my camera and I went there in 2016 and gave a talk and gave a kind of a few lectures at UBC, that we had inspired a whole new generation of filmmakers who use film as an activist language. So when I find more about that, I'll put it on my Facebook and let everybody this one, and that's going to be happening on July 20th in Vancouver.
Thank you so much. And we will love to share the message of that event, especially if it's hybrid, on the Culinaria research page and the EL library pages. So thank you very much, and a very good evening and good dining to everybody.
Have a happy meal. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Yeah.
Thank you, Cheuk.
Hi, Helen.
Oh, thank you. I got your email. Thank you so much. Sorry, because I have eye problems. That's why I don't review myself. Okay.
That's all right. I hope you're doing well.
Yes, you too. Okay.
I've been saying for a long time. Hello.
Hello. Long time no see. Okay. Talk to you another time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you, everyone. So